slipped those off, threw my partner off of him. He was digging his fingers down his throat and clawing up blood. And I yelled to the officer, "Tase his ass! Tase his ass!" I'd like to read for you an excerpt from a book written by somebody who is a very important mentor to me, and that is Meditations on Violence by Sergeant Rory Miller. Sorry, a little bit used there. I met Rory when I volunteered for a search and rescue team in my teenage years, and he was working as a corrections deputy at the time, and he was an advisor for that search and rescue team. He was also an EMT, and he taught a jiu-jitsu class that I attended, and the things that he taught me about violence and life and raising children and having a successful marriage, I have put his lessons to work almost every day of my life since then, and I'm just so grateful for him. I haven't seen him in years, and we've drifted apart. You know, I moved out here to Idaho, and he's a famous author now, so he's got other things that are going on in his life, but his book here has a section called The Chemical Cocktail, and this is what I want to talk about today. I want you to listen for the word tachypsychia, because I'm going to tell you a story about how this affected me. So I'm going to start reading here. Some of the hormonal effects are physical. He's talking about the hormonal effects of being in a violent confrontation. So under the stress hormones, peripheral vision is lost, and there's a physical tunnel vision. Depth perception is lost or altered, resulting in officers remembering a threat 5 feet away as down a 40-foot corridor. Auditory hallucinations occur. You may not hear gunfire or people shouting your name or sirens. Blood is pulled in the internal organs, drawn away from your limbs. Your legs and arms may feel weak and cold and clumsy. Everybody's had that happen to them, right? You may not be able to feel your fingers. You will not be able to use fine motor skills, the precision grips and strikes necessary for some styles, such as Aikido. I'll notice every now and then when some sort of scene that's really high intensity catches me off guard, I get a little bit of that kind of clumsy, shaky feeling right here in anything innervated by my ulnar nerve. When I feel that the pinky fingers kind of getting a little shaky, I know that I need to just stop and take a little breath. But anyway, continuing. Complex motor skills. Essentially, your coordination will be hampered with a strong enough cocktail. Trapping, combinations, throws, anything that requires hands and feet working together will be gone. Part is also mental. Perception and memory can be wildly distorted. You may remember nothing but a blur or incredibly precise details of inconsequential items. Time may seem to slow. He calls this tachypsychia. You may freeze and see everything happen, but not be able to move. Or you may think that you aren't moving when you are, but you are perceiving it in slow motion. Irrelevant thoughts will intrude. This is difficult to describe, but I've been in a fight and suddenly become obsessed with trying to remember what flavor our wedding cake was. So the story I want to tell you is about the first time I experienced tachypsychia. I've experienced this a few times, but the most notable one, I didn't even realize it until a few years later, and then I realized, oh yeah, that was time slowing down. So this is something that we used to try to train for in Rory's jiu-jitsu classes, but I don't know if he ever really figured out a technique to try to induce that in a person. I think that would be amazing if the perception of time slowing down could be something that you could learn how to induce. I don't know anyone who's ever figured that out yet, and I would need to check in with Rory again at some point to see if he's developed his ideas on that further. But this was a scene dispatched as first of all, years and years ago. It was a man in his early 20s, and it was dispatched as a seizure. Okay, yeah. Seizures happen. Lots of people have seizures disorders. However, the dispatch information was that the seizure looked like this. He was digging his fingers down to his throat, sitting on the edge of his bed, clawing his fingers down his throat and bringing up blood, and asking for his friends to kill him. Now, I was a young paramedic at the time. definitely no learned physician, and for sure seizures can be very complex and weird, but that was unlike any seizure I had ever seen or heard of before, and so I was fairly confident just from the dispatch information that we were not dealing with a seizure. Probably what happened is somebody, one of his friends who called 911 said, I think he's having a seizure, and so the dispatcher just ran with it. That's normal. Very rarely will the thing that we were dispatched to be the actual thing that we respond to. So I staged for police. I asked for police and I staged. That's pretty standard for EMS personnel. We don't typically have any use of force training officially. We don't carry weapons also officially. And it's just not our primary job to deal with some sort of violent threat. So I staged for police. I drove pretty close to the scene, and I found a place, a little dark corner. It was pitch black out, by the way. I just kind of tucked my chase car in there. And so there was also an ambulance that was coming. Anytime I respond with a chase car, an ambulance would also respond as well, because that's how we take the patient to the hospital, right? So that ambulance was staffed by 2 EMTs. And I'm going to be disagreeing with those EMTs and their actions. However, I do want you to know those are my friends, and I very much respect them. I respect them enough that I can respectfully disagree with them. So if any of them are watching, or if anybody figures out who they are, I am not disparaging them. I'm just simply disagreeing with them, and I think that's part of a healthy friendship. Does that make sense? I hope so. So I was staged on the road. The ambulance came flying by. They apparently decided not to stage. I disagreed with that. But it was their right to make that decision. They made a risk-benefit analysis, and so they went in. They thought they could handle it. Shortly thereafter, the deputy in his cruiser comes flying by, and so I just followed the deputy, and I didn't wait to be cleared at that point because I knew that my partners were in there. So I roll up, and the scene that I'm greeted with is the 2 EMTs on that and an ambulance crew were bringing the patient to the ambulance. The patient was not very well restrained. He was kind of poorly restrained, and so he was wiggling around. He was on the stretcher. It did not look like this patient was adequately contained to then get into the ambulance, which, there's lots of things that can be used as weapons inside of ambulances, and you'll see here in a minute why this was a terrible idea. And again, I'm not disparaging these guys. This was a tremendous learning experience, I think, for everyone involved. So people make mistakes. I make mistakes. I've made a lot of mistakes today. I bet you have too if you're watching this. So I jumped into the ambulance and I saw this guy. He was definitely not in his right mind. And so what we did is we began treating him under the doctrine of implied consent. This is a doctrine that dictates that if a person were of their right frame of mind, in the right state of mind, they would usually want you to help them, right? So in this case, the man is not able, he's not there enough, he's not oriented enough to communicate his actual wishes to us, and so we just assume, were he in his right mind, he would want us to help him like this. There's other reasons that we might treat somebody who can't specifically express consent, but we proceeded under the doctrine of implied consent. So I was drawing up some sedative because the way he was struggling against the restraints, the physical restraints that they had him, some soft cuffs, right? And then on his legs, there were some soft leg restraints, I believe. It's been a while. It's tough to recall all the details. So it takes time, right? It takes time to draw up these medications. I've got to get everything out of the wrapper. I've got to get the drugs out, especially with controlled substances. You have to pop the seal, and it's kind of a process. It's not just a really quick thing that you could load a sedative and a dart gun and, I wish. But it's a lot more complicated and time-consuming than I think a lot of people think. And so I yelled to those guys, hold him down. I'm going to drop the Versed. This is a benzodiazepine sedative. And then the guy somehow slipped his hands out of the soft restraint cuffs. I don't know if he was just really flexible or if they weren't on super tight, but he slipped those off, threw my partner off of him, and then sat on the edge of the stretcher and started doing the same thing that was described to us in the dispatch information. He was digging his fingers down his throat and clawing up blood and making all sorts of just strange, bizarre animal noises. And so my partner, who was initially trying to physically hold this guy down while I drew up the medications, right? He said, "I'm out," and he jumped out of the side of the ambulance. So the situation I found myself in was all alone inside of this vehicle full of things that can be used as weapons against me, with a crazy guy who's like now drawing up, he's clawing into his mouth and bringing up a biohazard, right? And I don't think a lot of people think about this when it comes to use of force by either law enforcement or EMS. If you're exposed to blood, that's a big deal, right? You could, in the most extreme case, die from some sort of bloodborne pathogen. You can spread it to your spouse. So best case scenario, you've got, pardon me, I've got a train. Best case scenario, if you're exposed to a bloodborne pathogen in the workplace, on the job, you've got 6 months of abstinence, 6 months of abstinence with your spouse. You've got 6 months of not sharing any sort of drink with your kids. If your kid brings a soda up to you and says, "Hey, you want a sip of my soda?" No, absolutely not, because you don't know what the hell you have in your body at that point. So it's not anything to be taken lightly. So some crazy person who's covered in blood, no, you should not expect the cops or the paramedics or anybody to just dive right in and take care of that, because that's a serious threat to them, to the responders. So anyway, I'm moving on. We got some wild coyotes. I hope you can hear them. This is a lot of fun. So I'm in the ambulance alone with crazy guy digging up blood out of his throat, making wild animal noises, and I've got a needle, and I'm nowhere near ready to like tackle him. And that's also a big risk, because he could take that needle and stick it back into me at any point. So I jumped out too, and I yelled to the officer for him to come over here, immediately. And so the guy, who at that point I started thinking maybe he's not as out of his mind as he's leading on, because he jumped up into the partition between the patient compartment and the front, and where the cab where you drive. A lot of ambulances will have a little pass through in between the cab and the patient compartment, so you can either wiggle through there if you absolutely had to, or you can holler to the person in the back, or if the person in the back needs you to slow down or whatever, they can holler up front. Anyway, so this guy jumps up front, and we had some bags and stuff, so he was starting to he's in the partition there. He was starting to dig his way through the bags to try to get through, and I yelled to the officer to get over there and take care of it. And the officer, this is where, in hindsight, I believe that I was dealing with that tachypsychia phenomenon. And the officer was moving irritatingly slow, but in hindsight, I think the officer was actually moving very quickly. It's just that with the chemical cocktail that Rory writes about in his book, my mind was moving so much faster than reality was moving. And so I heard the officer almost just in a slow, lackadaisical, just irritating manner, which I don't think was reality. I think that was just my weird perception of reality in that moment. He was yelling at me, "Stop right there, stop right there," almost like as if he had no enthusiasm at all into the situation. And so finally, after what seemed like ages, the officer tags him with his taser in the ass, and the guy, he screamed, "Ah!" And then I don't know what happened after that, but the taser did not have any sort of lasting effect. The guy continued wiggling up through the partition into the driver's seat, and from there, I saw him trying to attempt to work the controls. And so at that point, and there again, my mind, I believe, was thinking ultra fast. And it's going to be tough to describe the actual mindset that I had in that moment. It was like crystal clarity. I knew exactly what needed to be done at that moment. There was no question. I needed to run around the back of the ambulance and rip his ass out of the driver's seat. And so I took off, and then I ran to the back of the ambulance around, and I recall in that precise moment thinking, I know this is a bad idea, but this is a calculated risk to run to the back of this thing, because I knew he could jack it into reverse and smash me. But it was a calculated risk at that moment. And so I ran up to the driver's seat, or to the driver door, and my hand got on the driver door handle when all of a sudden he figured out how to get it into drive, and he took off. Now, it was wintertime, and in this driveway, there was a really large fir tree of some type, and so he glanced the left side of the box of the ambulance off this massive tree, but he was still able to drive, and he just drove straight into a snowbank, really deep snowbank. From there, this is why I think that the prosecutor may have dropped the ball on this one. They decided not to prosecute him because of what they thought insanity, but this guy actually was trying to troubleshoot his way out of that snowbank at that point, which I think takes a little bit of cognitive wherewithal. I remember clearly him dropping it into reverse, and I heard the backup alarm going. Nobody else heard this. I specifically heard that, and that's also something that Rory mentions in there, being able to like focus in on details and things and then other people maybe not be able to focus in on details at that moment. That guy dropped it into reverse and started trying to rock it out of the snowbank. And at one point he put it into neutral, and he revved that engine to really high RPMs, which I didn't realize this at the time. Somebody told me later that wrecks your engine, and that engine had to be replaced. I believe it was like $20,000 or something insane. So after that, he at some point came to the realization, while we were all running over there, that he ain't getting out of that snowbank. He jumped into the snowbank and ran off into the woods. They ended up catching up with him later, and he was fine. For anybody who is bizarrely worried about that guy who stole my ambulance. Anyway, that fine gentleman. But I tell you that story because I didn't even realize what was going on in the moment. Now that I do understand that more from a first-hand experience, I think I probably could recognize what's happening in the moment, but I don't have it happen very often anymore. I don't know why. It might be that I have more experience. I'm a little bit more inoculated to what's going on in super stressful situations. Usually I keep a fairly cool head, but like I mentioned, every now and then I'll get into something that's a little bit stressful, something I haven't really encountered before or haven't encountered in a long time, and I'll get that little nerve reaction. And I think everybody just kind of needs to be in tune with their own body enough to know when that's happening. So I appreciate you listening. That was the time that I experienced the chemical cocktail firsthand, and my ambulance got jacked, and it hasn't happened since. Haven't had another ambulance stolen again, thankfully. So I've got some other things in the works that I think you'll like. I don't have them out quite yet. I don't have everything finished the way I exactly want it quite yet, and so I'm not going to release this project early, but I hope you'll like it. It's not something I think that everybody's going to love, but it might have some use for educators and anybody who is interested in pushing the limits of their amateur radio software. So I appreciate you watching. I'm not going to edit this. You're going to get every and that I said. But have a great evening, everyone.